Hi, my name is Kevin Kuntz. I'm one of the directors of Friends of the Ludlow Auditorium. Jim Alec is our chairman, is unfortunately under the weather this evening, is not able to fulfill his duties as the moderator, and I will be the substitute moderator. This is the biannual candidates forum, which we've run for the last 12 years. This auditorium was redone approximately 2008 to 2009, and our founding chairman, Ralph Pace, founded this organization called FOLA. So if you hear me refer to FOLA, it's Friends of the Ludlow Auditorium. We've invested a lot of time, effort, and energy to try to update this system or this auditorium to the beauty that you now see. We have behind us, which you don't see, which was down before, a full screen. We run movies here on a monthly or bi-monthly basis, and it's become a great pride of the town and of us as members of FOLA. So welcome to everybody. This is going to be follow a question and answer format. Each one of the state Senate candidates will have an opportunity to answer the question that I give. They have had no prior knowledge to whatever the questions are, and they will have 2 minutes to answer it. Jacqueline Deasenhouse will be my timer. She will put up 30-second timers, a minute and a half, a minute, 30 seconds, and 15 seconds, and then at 2 minutes, a beeper will go off, and I will ask you to stop at that time. If you continue talking, I will please ask you to stop a second time. And here's the sound, we hope. The questions will be answered in a rotating sequence. Okay, go ahead. That's your time. That means you're up.
Oh, that's such a gentle, nice
Okay.
sort of reminder.
Is there any tone indicating you've got 10 seconds? Or?
No, you will have something that comes to 30 seconds.
Yeah.
So you can just sort of pay attention to
Can you read
your
that?
right-hand side,
No.
and she'll shake them at you at the 10 seconds. So that the audience understands the format. The questions will be answered in a rotating sequence, left to right, as you are looking at the candidates. Each new question will be initially answered in a rotating advanced sequence. So Allison will answer the first question. It'll go all the way down to Bill, and then the second question will be answered by Dana, and so on until we go all the way around. We will try to get 6 questions done, and then we will open it up to audience participation, so people will have an opportunity to ask questions, and their questions will be directed not at an individual, but at the entire community, and they will start, again, if we happen to do it properly, Allison will start first, and we'll go all the way through in those same response category. Is that clear to everybody? There's 2 minutes for each response and 1 minute for a rebuttal. You do not have to use the 2 minutes, and I know I'm dealing with politicians, and that's a tough question to answer, and you do have a chance to rebut for 1 minute. If you don't have to rebut, and maybe not something that is necessary, but that's the format. Any questions on the format? If not, let's get going. I'm sorry? Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you very much. My goodness. Candidate bios. Allison Clarkson, thank you. That's my manager in the back. I don't know what I'd do without her. Allison presently serves as Majority Leader in the Vermont State Senate, having served in the Vermont House for 12 years representing Plymouth, Reading, and Woodstock. She was elected in 2016 as a senator for Windsor County. Allison serves on multiple committees in the Senate and is particularly involved in the workforce and economic development and climate situations. Before moving to Vermont, Allison was a theater producer in New York. In Vermont, she has been active in numerous boards. Dana Carlson, Dana of Sharon, Vermont, was raised on a small dairy farm in Royalton and Barton. He graduated from Vermont Tech and later from Franklin Pierce College. In 2014, Dana founded a small Vermont-based company, North North Country Welding Supply and is acutely aware of how hard it is for small businesses to survive in Vermont. Dick McCormick began his Senate career in 1989 and has served as Majority Leader, Chair, Vice Chair of multiple committees, and has served on most other Senate committees. Dick has also been a folk singer, band leader, humorist, broadcaster, and many other endeavors. He lives in Bethel. Alice Flanders lives in White River Junction and is a retired Navy engineer and former teacher. She is focused on education in Vermont. If elected, this would be her first elected office. Rebecca White. Becca is a lifelong Vermonter, growing up in Wilder, now living in White River Junction. She graduated from UBM and began her career as an organizer for a local solar company, and now works for Efficiency Vermont. After serving on the Hartford Select Board, she was elected to the Vermont legislature. Bill Huff, although originally from Maine, Bill has lived in Thetford since 1984. With a degree as a professional pilot from Purdue, Bill was a bush pilot in Alaska and then a Boeing 767 pilot for TWA. He then built a second career as a certified financial planner. He retired from both careers in 2013 and 2014. And I will now go to the questions. The first question. Almost every business in Vermont is looking for employees. One of the barriers to employment is the availability and affordability of childcare. What actions would you recommend? Allison?
Thank you. Yes, we have a child care crisis in the state, and I think around the country. It's one of the major we have 26,000 people who have chosen to exit the workforce at the moment, which is exacerbating our challenge. And we have in front of us one of the most significant things we'll be addressing this year is how we sustainably fund child care in the state. And the state, of course, pays significantly for child care for low-income families, and for some middle and lower income families. And certainly the families are paying for child care, but businesses are not actually carrying their sort of fair weight in supporting child care in the state. And so I think one of the things we'll be looking at is how we equitably balance the funding of child care in Vermont. It is, as the crisis is not just the funding for the child care, but it's also funding and providing pay for the child care workers who are traditionally very poorly paid. And so how we have high expectations in terms of their education and their standards, but they are not well paid, and part of the challenge is figuring out how we both finance it equitably between those three parties, parents, state, and business, and how we also can afford to make it an industry people want to go into and that is remunerated in any kind of significant fashion.
I'll just make one if everybody could keep that mic close to your mouth.
Is that not close enough?
Yeah, just bring it up a little closer.
Kiss the mic.
Yeah, essentially. Becca, could you do the same thing? Just make sure it's
Yeah,
up
I can
nice and
move it,
close.
yeah.
Great. Thanks very much.
Is that good?
Dana?
Yes, I agree. Childcare is a major issue here in the state. I'll give you an example of one case where the state got it wrong. I've got a couple who are friends of mine who had a daycare run out of their house. They have a nice house, finished basement, and the daycare was in the basement. It's a walkout basement with a nice fenced-in play area outside. The state came in and said, well, you got to have a bathroom in the basement. They don't want the kids going up into the main house to use the bathroom. So my friend built a bathroom. Then they came in and said, well, we got a problem with that tying into the sewer system. So he said, well, okay, how about I tee off the D box and add a second leach field? They said, no, that wasn't acceptable. It needed an entirely new septic system just for the daycare. Now, they've had no problem with this sewer system, and it's been fine for 20 years. They gave up. They said, that's enough. We're not putting the money into it, and they quit. Daycare closed. That's why we have a shortage.
Nick?
Thanks. I noticed that our colleague and friend Alice Nitka is here, and for many years, she made the point that we do not make it easy for the home daycare givers. Our regulations do tend to focus on daycare centers, but not the kind of small-scale at-home facility. And I think at this point, we really do have to look for ways to make it easier on the home worker. I wish I could hit the ball out of the park on this and just give you a real quick answer. That's the answer. But the fact is, we need more money. We need to pay daycare workers better. And in terms of the government doing that, it's not our money, it's the taxpayers' money. We are stewards and trustees of their money, and the taxpayers are only willing to come up with so much. So one way or another, though, the people who do this important work are not adequately paid, and that's something we're going to have to look at.
Alice?
Well, all of those are really great ideas, but in addition to those, I'd like to say this is not a new problem. It's not even a problem just for the state of Vermont or the United States, and this has been met around the world in certain communities around the world. The businesses themselves take it upon themselves as part of the whole package of supporting the workers to provide an on-site facility or assistance for their workers, because you see, it's a problem of workers. We don't have enough workers because it's difficult for people to work. If the workers are an important resource for the businesses could be incentivized to help the workers more. And I believe that it would be, they would be able to get more workers because the facilities are there, and the parents are able to be closer in to their children. And that way you're not just leaving the care of your children to some daycare facility that's remote from you. And in addition to that, I would say that instead of looking at this as a complete problem for the, quote, state to fix, I believe we as a community ought to do what we can to embrace our collective solution.
Becca?
Well, thank you everyone so much for coming out tonight. I'll just start there, and thank you, Kevin, for moderating. I grew up in a daycare. My mom ran a daycare my whole childhood, and that was the way that she was able to have a full-time job, make ends meet, run a small business, and raise her children. So I fully understand the difficult decisions that Vermont parents are making at the moment. And most Vermont parents are looking at their paycheck and they're looking at the cost of childcare, and it's not adding up. They're saying, I could stay home with my child and I would be making about the same amount of money in a cost analysis. We need to have workers in Vermont to support young families. We need to continue to subsidize childcare. We need to have a more robust subsidization of childcare. There are 3 folks at these tables who were endorsed by Let's Grow Kids, which is the premier organization that's defending childcare. That's Senator Clarkson, Senator McCormick, and myself. I want to highlight some of the solutions that we could bring to this problem. Something I was really proud of to vote forward in the House this last session was to switch from child copay to family copay for childcare. It's little solutions like that that make it easier for families to not just have one child but multiple children to balance that cost when they're considering daycare. Something else I wanted to highlight is that 80% of the Vermont workers who are not returning to the workforce are women. So we can squarely put daycare and childcare as a foundational problem for why Vermonters are not returning to work. And the last thing I want to highlight is we did a ton of work on this topic last session, but we have so much more that we can do because we're missing about 8,000 spots needed to cover all children in Vermont with high quality, accessible childcare.
Bill?
I just wanted to quickly thank the Friends of the Ludlow Auditorium for hosting this. I think it's a great opportunity for candidates to speak to the public, and thank you for everybody that did show tonight. It was 2017, the last time that the legislature really looked at regulations for daycare, home daycare and daycare centers. And unfortunately, there was a couple of tragedies that had occurred recently, or just before that, when they started looking at it in 2017. The end result was for the legislature to overregulate an industry, and unintended consequence was that nearly half of the home daycare facilities went out of business as a result of that overregulation. And you'll probably hear me talk about that quite a bit this evening, is Vermont getting in the way of business, and this is one of the examples. I believe, from what I heard, the question was about availability and not necessarily funding. But it does bring up, and a lot of candidates touched on the money aspect. And again, the regulatory environment that Vermont businesses operate under, just as a quick comparison with New Hampshire, for a particular age group of child, New Hampshire will allow a daycare facility to have one more than we do in Vermont. If it's up to age 2, I think Vermont's regulations say you can care for 3 children, but in New Hampshire it's 4. If the child is 3, then it's 5 and 6. Well, imagine yourself in business, and it's a home daycare type environment. You've got fixed costs. You've got the cost of heat, electricity, and whatnot. So what Vermont has done by over-regulating this particular issue is take away the profitability from that business. And that's where you'll find funding, and you'll find people gravitate towards this business, and we'll have more businesses as if we can stop the over-regulation and allow them to be profitable.
Perfect. Each candidate will have a 1-minute rebuttal time. Allison?
I think we've explored it pretty fully. So I
I'll go
think
down
I'm
the
fine
table.
with where we are.
Anything further they want to say? 1 minute. Great, let's move on to question 2. What's your view about short-term housing rentals? Should there be a state rental registry, or should it be left up to local action?
No on the registries. Again, too much regulation tends to stifle business and the rental industry. I'm more for free markets, and there's a lot of second homes that could be rented in Windsor County. Airbnb, I know some people who use Airbnb, and it works very well for them, and I'd like to see them be able to continue that. And housing in general, we've got a shortage, and there's the supply and the demand side of that. Since COVID, a lot of people have been moving up here to get away from the big cities, and some of them becoming permanent residents, some of them buying second homes. But I'll get probably hopefully into some of the other questions, more into the permitting that's restricting the supply, and the tech schools educating our future contractors. So housing is definitely a big issue that we need to focus on, and I would focus primarily on reducing the regulations, not adding more. Thank you.
Dick?
Thanks. I think abstract political philosophy is the foundation of all of our thinking and talking about policy. And I have no objection to abstract political philosophy. But you really can't govern with just abstract philosophical generalities. I hear a theme emerging here that there's too much regulation, and there may well be. I am a citizen too. I am often aggrieved by regulation, but I need to hear what regulation? What's wrong with this or that regulation? and then what do you propose as an alternative? It's very easy to just, when I was in the minority, I got to say, I thought it was bad for the state when the Democrats were the minority in the Senate. But personally, I loved it. I wasn't answerable for anything, just throw darts. And it was fun, and I always came off looking like a winner. But you've really got to come up with real answers. What regulations do you want to do away with?
Alice?
Okay. I'm not for just removing regulations for the sake of removing them, but we are here in Vermont. We are a community. What happens when we overregulate, as far as I see, is that we limit the ability of those who are providing services. Oftentimes, I'm not saying no regulations, we limit, we restrict, we tie the hands of those who would step up and meet the current need by these very extreme regulations. I don't know which regulations they are, but I know this: if we have a housing problem, if we have a shortage of short-term housing or short-term rentals or whatever the issue is, if there are those who will step up to help us as a community meet our needs, we have to do our part to help them help us. And if that means looking at what is holding them back from providing it. For example, if we want to limit the amount of resources they receive in compensation for providing these rental units, is it that you really don't want these rental units to be available? Most people are not out there to just make money and squeeze the last drop of blood out of the turnip, but you've got to make it possible and practical for people to meet those needs. So I'm not for limiting, getting rid of all regulations, but I am very concerned about overregulating and helping all of us meet our community needs.
I'll just remind everybody that this is directed towards short-term rentals, not rentals in total. So it's more specifically to short-term rentals. Becca?
Thank you. Short-term rentals, Airbnb, Vrbo. I know that anyone in this town is familiar with the glut of short-term rentals that you have in your community, where we're seeing rising rental costs and then rising housing costs because folks can do something that was recently covered in the Chester Telegraph, which is ghost hosting, where someone has multiple properties and they're renting it out short-term style and they're making a quick buck. There's a couple of problems I have with that. One, it stops young families like myself from being able to afford to live here long term. Two, it doesn't provide for safety for the people who are renting those locations. My husband and I, we have an Airbnb that we have out of a third bedroom. I think that's totally fine if we get taxed on it, if we have to be in a registry, so we can have proper fire safety codes that we're meeting as a household. So what I see for our goals with short-term rentals is really cracking down on the ghost hosts that you may have read about in the Chester Telegraph, as well as multiple places that are being rented out that is raising the rental costs for the people who are living here full time. And the last thing I'd like to cover on this topic is that the legislature put it in the hands of municipalities in this last biennium, where we gave them the tools to decide how they would like to have an ordinance on short-term rentals. So I see that we've got a direction that your municipality could move, because it's not about are you in favor of regulation or are you not in favor of regulation. It's who should be making decisions about short-term rentals in your community. And what the legislature has decided is that we think an individual community, a municipality, is best placed to make those decisions versus a catch-all policy for the whole state. Because Ludlow versus White River Junction, we're going to have different relationships to short-term rentals.
Bill?
Well, Senator McCormick, I would agree with you that there is a theme probably emerging here tonight, and that is the overregulation by the state. I would certainly agree with that. And the registry idea is another step in that direction. It's a first step into trying to tell individuals what they can do with properties that they own. When you stop and look at who owns these properties, the second homes that are often vacant and are prime for that bed and breakfast Airbnb type rental, we're looking at out-of-staters, probably more than not. And of course, that means they can afford that second home, that they have money. Well, I'm not going to demonize those people for the sake of trying to make more housing here. They've done nothing illegal. I'll give you a quick example of one of the issues here. And the only reason I know about this is I was doing a sine wave in Bethel, and I had a landlord stop and talk with me, and he told me about a case where a single mother had bought a duplex. In this case, it's not that overnight rental, it was more of a long-term rental. But it brings up again the issue of regulation and how it's unfair in this state. The single mother rented out the other side of the duplex with the idea that she was going to pay the mortgage on the duplex, on the facility. The renter that she had didn't pay the rent, and she couldn't afford to pay the mortgage on her own. So consequently, the single mother now is homeless, and the renter, who has all kinds of rights in the state of Vermont, was able to stay there. So there needs to be a balance between the regulations for tenants and landlords. And right now, landlords are under a huge disadvantage in the state.
Allison?
Thanks. I'd like to bring it back to short-term rentals. Short-term rentals are gutting our communities, and we have a housing crisis in the state, and we have maybe 6,000 to 8,000 short-term rentals that have emerged. And the business community came to the legislature and said, we would like to have a level playing field. The inns, our B&Bs, our hotels, all came to us and saying, this is unfair. They are not regulated at all, and we want to level the playing field, and we have been working towards doing that. First we required that they all be taxed equitably, that anyone who has a lodging establishment of any variety is subject to the rooms and meals tax. And then the second thing we did was to what Becca referred to, the health and safety, tried to address the health and safety issue. And that if they're in a town, there are 6 towns that actually have registries that all function beautifully, and they have inspections. We now require that every Airbnb, every short-term rental post how to be in touch with the health department, so that if there's a health and safety issue, and we've heard about a number of them in the legislature, people can be in touch and report them. And then, of course, we did the lowest hanging fruit and we provided the opportunity for every town, every municipality to set and create their own ordinance for short-term rentals. I've had many towns actually come to me and say, we actually want the state to regulate this. We don't want to have it up to us. So it will be, I think we'll have further discussion this legislative session. I would just like to say that during the registry, I would have loved during Irene to have had a registry. I would have loved to known where there were places for us to house in Woodstock the people who were displaced. A registry doesn't regulate anything. It's already all publicly available.
Thanks, Allison. Yes, Dick?
Thanks.
1 minute for a rebuttal.
Yes. I failed to actually answer the question. I responded more to the abstract notion about regulations. To answer the question, an economy driven by market forces, the law of supply and demand, has made us a prosperous and happy nation. We're all in favor of market forces. However, the idea of totally unregulated market forces it was tried in the late 19th century, and it's a nightmare. And in terms of rental, market forces are driving the short-term rental problem. It's more profitable to rent short-term than to rent long-term, and it has created a problem of housing. Maybe it didn't create it, it has certainly made it much worse It's one of the causative factors. And so we do need to use our democratic authority to let we, the people, through our government, at least get a handle on, this is one of those examples of market forces not being our friend.
Anyone else? Dana?
So I've also talked to a long-term landlord who says he will not even consider renting or leasing to anybody for less than 2 years because of the state being so landlord unfriendly for long-term rentals. So if we were a little more friendly to the long-term rentals, maybe we'd have more of them available as long-term instead of short-term. Thank you.
Anyone else? Yes, Bill?
Yeah, I'm in a race, a house race actually as well. I'll be on the ballot twice in 3 different towns. And my opponent, Rebecca Holcomb, for the house race, I overheard her talking to somebody about the Airbnb issue, and her solution was going to be that they were going to be able to force those people that own bed and breakfast and rent it out via Airbnb, force them into more long-term type rentals. We have a housing shortage in this state, and who in their right mind is going to invest capital in housing when the state is going to come in and tell you who you can rent to? That's going to be an impediment to increasing overall housing in the entire state.
Anyone else? Allison, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think we're in the business of telling people who they can rent to, but I would say that we are in desperate need of long-term rentals. I think that those are some of the stories you're talking about are certainly exceptions. I would say that we now have, we have 6,000 to 8,000 rental units out there that could be for full-time Vermonters. So this is exacerbating our problem, short-term rentals. Burlington has just enacted a short-term rental law, and the owner has to live in a house. I mean, there's some very inventive things going on that we should be exploring and that every town should be exploring. But I don't think anyone is identifying who has to live in the rental. I think we just need rentals. We're desperate for rentals for our families who want to work and live here.
Anyone else? Yes, go ahead, Alice.
I would just say that if you overregulate the short-term rentals, and I understand that I didn't actually address the short-term rentals, but if you overregulate the short-term rentals that are meeting a need, you don't necessarily assist the long-term rentals. If you make it hard for someone who is meeting a niche or requirement in the community, the long-term rental situation has to be addressed. But if you cut off or make it difficult for people to have short-term rentals that are required, where have you have to make it all balanced because we are living together as a community. Yes, the short-term rentals will be profitable. They are. But because they are profitable, does that mean that their profitability has limited the solution for the long-term rentals? And I'd say that some people who have chosen not to do long-term rentals for one reason or another may not have done it with the sense of doing harm there. They've just done what's profitable, what works.
Anyone else? Great, let's move to the third question, and Dick, you will start that. Opioid addiction and death, particularly with surge in fentanyl use, continues unabated in Vermont. What specific actions do you recommend to attempt to reduce the impact on Vermont lives and communities?
Thanks. It is a very unpleasant experience to be running for office and to be asked a question to which the honest answer is, I really don't know. And neither does anyone else. Addictive substances, by virtue of being addictive, are very hard to get a handle on, and we have large numbers of people some of whom are dying in large numbers, but even those who do not die, they have severely diminished qualities of life. An addict may be in a perpetual state of recovery, may go on to live a life, but is really an addict for life. And I will say this, that I think several years ago, we did get certain things right. Number one, treat the importers and sellers of drugs, illegal drugs, as criminals, and treat addicts as sick people in need of our help. Unfortunately, there's a gray area there because some people who are addicts in their desperation pay for their needs, including their drug needs, by selling. So that's hard to decide which group does a person fall into. But the basic philosophy, I think, is correct. The merchants of death are criminals. The addicts are our neighbors and friends in need of help. And we don't have enough addiction aids, help for addicts, addiction centers, recovery centers, close enough. There are people who, if they're getting chemical assistance in dealing with the physical manifestations of withdrawal, there are people who have to travel an hour and a half a day to get the medication. We've got to make it easier for people to clean up.
Alice?
I'd have to say that one of the first things we realize is that when we have criminals who bring themselves into our state, you know, these people don't generally come from Vermont. They come here from New York. They come here from Massachusetts. They have a particular method of hawking their wares. When they are arrested, when we become aware of their presence, there should not be a catch and release kind of mentality for dealing with them. Our laws should be, actually, I would say, harsh, because they're not only stealing the lives of these people who are our people, our young people, they're also robbing us of our future assets in this state. One less or several less people who are going to be the builders of our community. I would like to see us taking a proactive step in dealing with the problems, these social problems of addiction. One of the first things I'd like to have the kids understand is that even though our popular culture makes it look appealing to engage in drugs, that we should do everything we can to help them see that this removes their ability to make their lives better and not glamorize it at all. This will be going against the popular narrative. I have come from environments where there were people who were presented with this alternative to a clean life. And I have, because I didn't want to go that way. I had people who encouraged me not to go that way. Then I didn't go that way. And I think that we have to do it twofold. One, those who are the criminals need to be stopped. End of that discussion. And let them know they're not welcome. Those who haven't gotten there, we have to encourage them not to. And we have to make certain that those who are addicted get treated.
Thank you, Alice. Becca?
Thank you. I've been to too many funerals, too many memorial services for classmates who've died due to substance abuse disorder, due to overdose. 210 Vermonters died in 2021. And between the years of 2019 to 2020, we saw a 1/3 increase in substance abuse-related death. That's unacceptable, and we need to have solutions. What I was impressed by this last legislative session was the amount of money that was moved to actually support substance abuse treatment programs. We need more inpatient beds, and we need outpatient services that are well-funded and can provide long-term support. I'm proud to say that I'm sober for 2.5 years from alcohol, and I've been active, thank you, and I've been active in the recovery community. And I know that there are members of the recovery community who don't feel like they're being treated with respect. They feel that they're treated like addicts, like people who have a problem. And what I want to really communicate to the collective here is that substance abuse disorder is a disease. It's not someone's fault, and it doesn't make them a bad person. And what I'm impressed by with our legislature is we get that. And we have solutions that base our substance abuse treatment on the fact that it's a disease and a medical condition that needs support just like any other disease or mental health crisis someone might be facing. With my last 30 seconds, I just want to highlight that Senator Clarkson and I went door-to-door knocking in Wethersfield, and we were deeply touched by the story of a mother who was raising her grandchildren while her daughter was struggling with substance abuse. And what she asked of us was to continue to fund programs that had inpatient and outpatient services, because opioid addiction doesn't just affect the user, it affects the entire family system. And I'm so proud that we were able to talk to that mother and be able to bring her story to the legislature this next session.
Bill?
Well, I've talked to quite a few people out campaigning myself, and I don't think most people realize just how bad the drug problem is in this state. It is horrendous, and it needs to be fixed. That's why if you go to my website, I actually have a three-step plan. I want LEADS instituted in schools statewide. LEADS stands for Law Enforcement Against Drugs. It's a program run by the Sheriff's Department for grades 3 through 8. It's, I believe, an 8 to 10 week program where the sheriff actually comes into the schools and works with the children, teaches them about the harms of drugs. A sidebar is that it's a great opportunity for kids to befriend a law enforcement agent while they're there. The second tenet of my plan is we need to get tougher on drug dealers. I'm not talking about people of addiction, but drug dealers need to be behind bars. A quick example in my hometown of Thetford. A couple of years back, Deputy Stewart arrested a drug dealer at the Park and Ride in Thetford, hauled him off to jail. He was extradited to New Hampshire because he was wanted there too, went through the process, and the very next day, 24 hours later, Stewart rearrested the same drug dealer in the same parking lot. That can't stand. We're not going to solve the problem if that's the kind of policies that we have. Third thing is rehabilitation. Some people are able to go through the processes we have now and recover, but a lot of them are not. We need to do something different when it comes to rehabilitation. I would love to see the Windsor old prison open back up again and operated as a farm where we could bring people in, teach them a skill, let them work with the animals, let them grow vegetables. I was in a debate the first time I ran, and the guy came up after me after the debate, and he begged me, if you get elected, reopen the Windsor prison, because he learned a skill while he was there, and that was the only reason that he was able to go out in society and continue a normal life. So that's what we need to do. We need a different kind of rehabilitation.
Allison?
Thank you. I'd like to build on what Becca and Alice actually addressed, because this is a huge problem and it's tragic and it's brutal on so many of our families. I have a dear friend in our neck of the woods who's raising her grandchildren as well, and that's just heartbreaking. First, I think we really have to address trauma. Trauma early on in age. To go to Alice's point, prevention. I think we need to invest huge amount more in prevention and addressing trauma once it rears its head in a child. And I think we need to be, if we could reduce trauma in our children and prevent the problem early on and address it, then I think we would avoid huge numbers of challenges later on. I think the second, so I firmly support all the programs that help prevent the problem from arising, prevent substance abuse disorder arising in the first place. The second is we have an inadequate recovery system. We need to invest significantly more in it. People, in the woman that Becca and I spoke to, her daughter was only able to stay for 2 weeks. Valley Vista is only for 2 weeks. It doesn't take 2 weeks to recover from a lifetime of substance abuse disorder. It takes months, it takes years. And we need much better we need much longer recovery programs. We need to invest significantly more in than following that person back into the community and providing them with supports, workforce training, help provide a really terrific and productive life. And I think with the supports in the community once they go back into it are critically important. So I think those are the two things. And the third thing is we're going to have a huge amount of opioid settlement money coming to us, and we have the opportunity with that money to invest it significantly in better, more effective recovery and rehabilitation.
Dana?
Yeah, I agree. This is a huge issue. It's tearing this state apart, and we've got to do something. The last 4 years, I was part of the Tunbridge-based intelligence based policing group advocating on this issue. Bill was a part of that. Allison's son Ward was also a part of that. We had an event at the Vermont Law School, which I moderated, that we discussed this issue with all the stakeholders from all levels of law enforcement, probation, parole, prosecution, principals, teachers, some politicians, and the news media. And it was very informative. And so I backed the plan that Bill had laid out, and that would help us get in the right direction. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be a quick fix. But we have to be vigilant and keep working on the issue. And the catch and release of criminals doesn't work. We got to get tough on the dealers and lock them up so they're not peddling those drugs out on the streets, and give our law enforcement officers the tools they need to do the job and the support. They do a heck of a job, and we need to support them fully. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody, any other responses? Great. Alice, excuse me, Alice, the next question will start with you. Sort of along the same line, mental health care is in crisis in Vermont and nationally. What specific legislative action do you suggest?
Well, when we talk about mental health care, that really impacts everybody in the state, and it goes from it's a spectrum from small to highly impacting on our communities. I would have to say that we need to recognize that many times when people are impacted by mental health issues, that it's not because of their own, not always because of their own personal shortcomings. And if there is something that is organic that we can assist in, we need to make certain that we can provide that medical or psychological or medical assistance. I would like to make certain that if there are things that impede our people accessing mental health in hospitals or in clinics, that we try to make certain that those impediments are removed. Another thing that has caused mental health issues during the last couple of years has been the way we've had to deal with COVID lockdowns, and that has exacerbated a lot of our mental issues. When we legislate, or when we see that we're presenting a community environment that's going to result in additional stresses, we have to be sensitive to what the impact on the mental state of our people would be. How can you deal? You see the suicide rates have gone up. You've seen overeating. You've seen a number of things happen during this COVID crisis. And I don't know if there has been meeting those challenges with any real solutions. So if we do have something that brings on mental challenges.
Thank you, Alice. Becca?
Thank you. If there was one legislative action that I could take tomorrow, it would be to expand the access to psychiatrists and therapists. If you're trying to find a therapist in Vermont right now, good luck. It is extremely difficult. And that's because we don't have a robust telehealth network for these professionals. So people who have to turn to apps, for example, to get services versus maybe going through their primary care provider, which would be a more comfortable relationship for many of us, or they're just not able to access someone physically in their community. So if I could take one legislative action, it would be to support therapists and psychiatrists in our local communities. There was an article today that described that 40% of Americans are experiencing anxiety or depression or both simultaneously. So I think we all need to recognize how difficult the last few years have been on all of us psychologically. And there's going to be a need for collective response when it comes to how we care for each other, coming back into kind of the before times experience we've all kind of lost a sense of in the last few years. So the last thing I wanted to mention was supporting our healthcare workforce, because the people who are caring for us are burnt out. And so people are turning to emergency rooms when they could be getting proactive services. And those emergency room workers are stressed and burnt out. So those are the two legislative actions I would take, would be supporting therapists and psychiatrists, expanding that field, and also supporting our healthcare workers who are really picking up the pieces right now without proactive support.
Here, here.
Bill?
A significant part or percentage of our mental health issues, I think, can be attributed to the drug problem that we just talked about. I think if we spend a lot of time and effort dealing with our drug problem, a lot of our mental health issues will subside as well. Now, having said that, anybody that knows me is I'm not a proponent of throwing money all over the place, but the state is extremely short when it comes to facilities, beds, and staff to deal with the mental health issue. And so as far as legislation would be concerned, that would be one place where I would be willing to spend tax dollars for the benefit of everybody in Vermont, to have more facilities, larger facilities, and paid staff to run those facilities. But again, just like I suggested with the drug problem, my third tenet was the rehabilitation. I think it's going to take some different approaches. Some people will do fine in a couple of weeks in a clinic, and others will not. I think you have to treat the whole body. They have to not only treat the mind, but they have to feel like they've got a purpose. And I think we should train them to do something, to do a trade, teach them how to weld or machine shop or work on a farm. If somebody gets up in the morning and has purpose in life, they're not going to turn to drugs, and they're much more likely to be of healthy mind.
Allison?
I agree with you, Bill. I think we all need to feel worth, and I think that's one of our challenges, period. I'd go back to trauma. Again, mental health and substance abuse disorders. Early trauma needs to be addressed in our lives here in Vermont. I think one of the challenges with expanding access to therapists and psychiatrists is the cost. The cost. I mean, trying to find somebody who takes insurance is impossible in the Upper Valley, and so that leads me back to how we fund healthcare. So if we had universal healthcare, it wouldn't be an issue. Everybody, it would be a seamless situation. But we also need, of course, more caregivers, more therapists, and more healthcare, more mental health providers. We underbuilt the state hospital. Bill's absolutely right. We underbuilt when we rebuilt after Irene the state hospital. We built it at 50% of what we needed. We needed at least 100 beds. As it's been. And we've added some beds around the state, but we really needed to build a 100-bed facility. And I think we still have not addressed a facility for our young people, which we still need to replace the one that's been closed. I think we also need to continue our program of embedding healthcare workers in our public safety network. We have a few of our state police and a few of our local police have embedded healthcare workers working with them, because so many of the issues they're dealing with are mental health issues. And so I think that program needs also expansion and work. But I think we need to use and deploy all of these things, addressing trauma earlier, addressing our healthcare system and how we pay for it so that everyone can have access to mental health care, and also building more beds to deal with people who are in real need and crisis.
Dana?
Well, I also agree with everything Bill said, and
that means me too.
yes. But I would also add to that, yes, I also am aware of, for instance, the Vermont State Police Major Crime Unit has 2 victims advocates who are healthcare professionals working with them, who do an excellent job. But in general, what are the stressors in your life? I mean, if you surveyed people, finances are a big stressor for a lot of people. The affordability crisis in this state is stressing a lot of people out. And we need to tackle that issue as well as substance abuse issues. And there's a lot of ways to do that. We've talked about some of the regulations that are stifling businesses, for example, stifling the housing market. So I would tackle those issues as well, and that would help the mental health issues in this state, I think, greatly.
Dick?
The term mental health is a big umbrella. It covers a variety of situations that all have certain things in common, hence the general term mental health, but they're in many ways very separate, distinct issues. I'm going to join the chorus here. I think Mr. Huff was right when he said that one of the big mental health issues we have is addiction. I think that, and of course, with any issue, there's a question of how important is the issue, how profound is the issue, and the other one is how immediate is the issue. And the one that we're facing right now, the arterial bleeding, is addiction, which we've discussed. I think also many mental health situations exacerbate themselves and become worse over time. So a adolescent who's experiencing anxiety and depression, dealt with properly, maybe, hopefully, just an adolescent episode. Left untended, that can become a lifetime of ever worsening and at times even crippling anxiety and depression. Once again, I think it's very important to not get too glib. There are problems that face us that I don't trust anyone who has a quick answer that they claim is going to solve everything. The fact is, this is an ongoing problem. But if nothing else, there are people who need to be kept off the street because they're dangerous. There are people who need to be dealt with because they're dangerous to themselves and need to be helped. So part of it is, as Allison mentioned, we need more beds. But we also need more in the community help as well.
Great. Let's move to Becca. Here's a question that seems to come up almost on a perennial basis, and it's been around for a while. Everybody spoke. Alice started.
She did last time.
I did want to make a comment.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Because it's easy to say, get more beds. It's easy to say, build more facilities. But we know in the end that it's going to come out of our coffers, and there are limits to what we can do. So I did like what Mr. Hupp had to suggest, and that was an approach that might not cost as much and might gain more benefits than just building a facility, but proactively working to help them see how they can become very involved and in fact gain worth by what they could become involved with, working with animals or developing a skill. Just building beds. Now, I'm not saying that that's what anybody advocated, but building beds or getting more facility, all of those things are fine in theory, but we don't have endless money. So we need to come up with solutions that can work from the ground up and eventually help the person not be a permanent patient.
Anybody else like to redirect? All right, then I'll move on to Becca. This is a perennial question. It seems to have been around since we started first coming here to Vermont in 1983. There's always a debate about Act 250. Do you have specific recommendations for modification of Act 250, and for what purpose?
Thank you so much for that question. I'll just start by saying that Act 250 has been so important for maintaining the Vermont that we know, that we love, the green spaces that we all hold close, and kind of the character of the state that we live in. And I understand that there are folks on this panel, for example, Senator McCormick, who have really championed both modernizing Act 250 and figuring out where we can be successful in supporting developers at the same time. I don't have any specific articulated changes I would make to Act 250 that I would share tonight, but what I would say is coming out of the Natural Resources House Committee process, I was surprised to learn how quickly and efficiently the Act 250 process worked in the majority of cases, so that the bulk of Act 250 appeals were dealt with within under 60 days. So large-scale projects that need to have adequate analysis, we're getting that and getting it done in a timely manner. So before we throw out the book on Act 250 or someone tells you that it's the bane of the existence of Vermont and it's stopping all development, I think that we need to take a step back and look at some of the benefits that zoning and regulation has for our state, but also address how we can expand downtown development, for example, to address our housing crisis and support development of housing in rural communities that haven't been able to access it in the same way. And finally, I do want to get that percentage correct for you, which is 80% of Act 250 applicants were processed without a hearing. So when we think about the large-scale developments that are going through Act 250, it's places that would have a deep impact on our community and the character of those communities.
Bill?
There was a story on WCAX within the last 2 weeks, and I think probably more like this last week. And I wish I could remember the name of the town. It was a small town in Vermont. There was a proposed development that would have added housing. There was a nice green incorporated into the plan. I think there was opportunities for retail, general store or something to that effect. From what I could tell, the plan would have been a real advantage to the town. It would have added to the beauty in the town. The story went on to say that that plan now had been under review for 5 years, and the plan had been cut by 50% of its original proposal. That's what I hear when I talk to people about Act 250, and not necessarily 5 years, but it is an extreme impediment to any kind of growth or development in the state. And I understand its original intent 50 years ago, when Act 250 started, was to curb the growth that the interstate provided. The interstates were installed, came up through Vermont, and now within minutes you could get people from Massachusetts, New York, on their way up to Vermont. And development had to be regulated at that point. It was just going crazy. But Act 250 did go through a 50-year review, I think just within the last year or so. And I had been hopeful that they were going to take a look at that and be able to relax some of the provisions in 250 that had been such an impediment over the years to development and growth in Vermont. And rather than do that, it looks like they've doubled down on all the failed policies of 250. Act 250 now is worse than it was when we started, more restrictive.
Well, I sadly, I disagree with Bill. I don't think that Act 250 is an impediment. I think we've actually done quite a bit to, I wouldn't say relax, but to incent. So for me, Act 250 really helps us do smart and thoughtful development. We have, just to put in context, we have about 450 Act 250 applications a year, and only 10 or 20 of them are appealed, and those are the ones you hear about. Those are the ones that take longer. There's no question some are thorny. But they have impact on our communities, and we all know neighborhoods that we would like to see not damaged by too much development. However, I've been involved with one of the relaxations, I guess, of Act 250, which is to incent development in our downtown and village centers. We raised the cap on our priority housing projects, which are exempt from Act 250, and we raised them in villages and towns of under 6,000, because Putney was wanting to do a development of affordable housing project of more than 25 units, and they were capped at 25 units. So one of the things we actually have done in response to relaxing a little bit Act 250 is enabling more growth in our downtown and village centers. We've also streamlined the exemptions for priority housing, and it got rid of some of the extra steps that were involved, and we've reduced the neighborhood input if it meets the strict criteria that are required. And now priority housing in neighborhood development areas can be mixed income and or mixed use, and that is a big change. We think about these appeals, and we think about all the limitations, but I guess the one thing, being in Woodstock and watching a housing development that took 10 years to happen, and one appeal after another, I'd love to limit the number of appeals that could happen, but actually they are already limited, which I had not appreciated. So I need to understand that all more fully as well. But it is... I think it's worth defending Act 250.
Thank you,
It's
Allison.
incredibly important.
Dana?
So I might shock some of my Democratic colleagues here. I actually agree with Act 250 regulating some of the big developments. The difference is small development. That is where I would apply some exemption. I'll give you an example. I got a couple who are at retirement age, who are friends of mine in Tunbridge. They decided that they wanted to sell their existing house to their son, subdivide the property, and build a new house next door. Because of the number of acres and the fact that Tunbridge has no zoning, Act 250 kicked in. Project was eventually approved, but it cost them $10,000. So when you talk about affordable housing, you just raise that person's housing cost by $10,000 unnecessarily. So again, small projects should be exempted. I'll give you another housing example. I know another gentleman who was approaching retirement age, owned a machine shop in Berry City. He's surrounded by apartment buildings. Power's there, water's there, sewer's there, the structure of the building is there. He simply wanted to finish the second floor of the building to put in a rental unit for his extra income during his retirement. The city of Barry refused him. He could not do that. It's still sitting vacant to this day. So there's another fact of overregulation, restricting housing and raising the costs. So again, I would reduce, apply more exemption to smaller projects. I think it would make the system much better for us. Thank you.
Dick?
Thanks. Municipal regulation is not Act 250. But when people think of compromise, they usually think of two positions finding a middle point between the two of them. There is a better form of compromise, which if you will picture, rather than the line between the 2 points, a circle around two positions in which you honor both imperatives. And Act 250 is that kind of compromise. The Vermont Republicans of 1970, Dean Davis, Art Gibb, Jim Jeffords, gave us just that kind of a compromise. Between those who were saying, no development, Vermont's fine the way it is, we like it the way it is, leave it alone, and those saying, bring it on, bring it on. We want the tax revenues, we want the jobs, we want the capital. What Act 250 said basically was, do it. But when you do it right. And that's what the process works on. Now, there is a problem we have now with housing. And we don't want sprawl, we want development where we want it, which is downtown. There has been people who said we can encourage downtown development by weakening Act 250. The question called for a specific recommendation. We already have what are called umbrella permits for an industrial park, for example, where you get an Act 250 permit for the entire industrial park. And then any particular development within the industrial park, it only needs an amendment to that existing permit. We should have umbrella permits for downtown development, for specified cluster development.
Thank you, Dick. Alice?
Okay. Well, this is not my area of forte, but I would say that I do appreciate your last comment about the solutions and Act 250 and how it's evolved over the years. And we are working that whole issue out. It didn't come to an immediate and quick solution. However, I would like to also say that I do appreciate Dana's perspective that the small projects should somehow receive more exemptions from this whole process than the big problems. And lastly, I would just have to say that in science, in the research arena, we realize that 80% of our problems only come from 20% of the situations, and 20% of our problems come from the 80. So if we did see that 80% of the applications were not having difficulty, that's right. That means it is working. But that means we also have to concentrate our concerns on that 20% that are having the difficulty. And I bet you if we had to look at them, it wouldn't be the large programs, because it doesn't make any sense for businesses to go into a solution when you know you're going to be facing all these issues. They're the small problems. And many times these small projects don't need so much regulation, really. It only shuts them down. So I like what Act 250 is working, I believe. But we do have to, I believe, to ease the challenges on the smaller projects.
Thank you, Alice. Bill, we'll start with you on the sixth question. What is your view about the proposed abortion amendment to the state constitution?
I'm opposed to the Article 22. And not necessarily because I'm opposed to abortion, which is probably going to come to a huge surprise to a lot of people. I don't have an issue with abortion in the first trimester. I do in the third trimester, but specifically the Article 22, I think is just a horrible, horrible piece of legislation. The wording is so vague that everybody, proponents and people that are opposed to it will tell you, we don't know actually what it says. It's going to be decided in the court. Mm-hmm. So who in their right mind would vote for something that is admittedly so vague that we don't know what the end result is going to be until there are test cases that run through the court? To me, it just boggles the mind that we could actually have a proposed constitutional amendment that would be that vague and known that it'll wind up in a court. I just don't agree with the process.
Alice?
The process was very thorough and thoughtful. The process took 4 years. 2 different biennium began in the Senate. All constitutional amendments begin in the Senate, and was vetted by many committees, written by our splendid legislative council. There's nothing vague about it. It protects our reproductive liberty and our decisions to make decisions about our own bodies. and reproductive liberty. And I support it 100%. There is nothing vague about it. It includes men and women. It protects families making contraceptive decisions. It protects men with vasectomies and women with abortions. It protects the state from a legislature that in the future may decide it wants to reverse some of these statutes. And it protects us from doing that by adding the compelling state interest, which means that anything change would have to pass a strict scrutiny test, which really means that this protects us from future legislatures trying to try and change things. So I firmly support Article 22. I hope Vermonters will support it as well. We all deserve the freedom to determine the course of our own lives and control our own bodies.
Thank you, Allison. Dana?
So I am, if elected, it'd be my job to represent the people. And according to polling, 68% of Vermonters are opposed to late-term abortions. So that is how I will vote. So I am opposed to Article 22. But I am not looking to take away a woman's right to choose. But there has to be some limits. As far as third trimester, if the mother's life is in danger, then, that's an exception. But in general, I would be opposed to late term and opposed to Article 22.
Dick?
Justice Alito's reasoning in the Dobbs decision did away with the finding in Roe that there is a fundamental constitutional right to privacy. But we in Vermont have the option to have our Constitution articulate that in Vermont there is a fundamental right to privacy,
Right.
a constitutional right. I think of the quote from Calvin Coolidge, if respect for our institutions were to vanish from the rest of the Union, it could all be replenished from this brave little state of Vermont. What this amendment says is that in Vermont, you have a realm of privacy, and if a woman's tax records are private, certainly her uterus ought to be. Now, the question is made that the accusation is made that we're too vague. The Constitution is supposed to paint with a broad brush. It lays down the big concept, and then we legislate to clarify that, and finally regulations clarify it, and the last word belongs to the courts. But the term compelling state interest is not obscure. This is a basic constitutional principle. And so too is the least restrictive means possible. Those are well-established, well-known legal terms, constitutional terms. And the compelling state interest provision, that's a protection against the amendment being used badly. And then the least restrictive means language, that's a protection against the protection. So that what we have is a clear, balanced approach protecting this fundamental right of privacy.
Thank you, Dick. Alice?
I can appreciate the sentiment for fundamental rights of privacy. However, when it comes to abortion, and I would like to say, first of all, I am an Orthodox Jewish woman. I'm a religious person. And in the Jewish religion, there are opportunities when abortion would be very much supported. For example, if the child presents a present danger to the life of the mother, then that mother has that option. The situations do come up. I'm not halakhic authority and I can't speak to it. I am not against it. I can appreciate that there may be times when that might be needed. However, I would say that in most situations, rape and incest don't come into the discussion for more than maybe even at most 5% of those abortions. They're elective surgery. But you see, when you have an abortion and you have an abortion in the 3rd trimester, this is not the same as removing a mole or an ingrown toenail or a tooth. We're talking about a child, especially in that 3rd trimester, who is viable outside of the uterus. I want you to know that in most cases around the world, in fact in the Netherlands, where they had very liberal perspectives on all of these things, that now the discussion of not the life of that child, okay, so you give the life of the child away to the mother. The mother's got to care for it, the mother's got to pay for it. That discussion went on to a discussion of the other side of life, the older people. And in the case now in the Netherlands, if someone is old and goes into a care facility, they may be terminated by their doctor. I'm not talking about de jure, but de facto, the doctor might decide to terminate that life. I personally, my mother was my mother was born to a 15-year-old girl who had a relationship with a guy who was going to college. She, 5 months, was delivered, and I'm so glad that I'm here.
Thank you, Alice. Becca?
Thank you. This is an issue I'm extremely passionate about. As a young woman, as potentially the youngest woman ever elected to the state Senate, I think it's imperative that people who are impacted by reproductive health care are at the seat at the table to make decisions about it, and this constitutional amendment will guarantee bodily autonomy for every single Vermonter under this. I want to talk about 2 things. The first is to agree with Senator Clarkson. This is not a vague amendment. The rhetoric that's being used by well-funded organizations like Vermonters for Good Government, those organizations are feeding you a load of crap about how this is a vague amendment. I am so excited for when I get my updated Constitution when we vote in Article 22 and Proposition 2. What I do want to talk about is late-term abortion, because it comes up again and again in these conversations. Article 22 will not change Vermont medical process at all. In the same way that when I voted to enshrine Roe v. Wade, it did not change medical practice. At 21 weeks and 6 days, if that's where you are in your term, you have to go under the Ethic Board of Review to actually get abortive services in Vermont. At the UVM Medical Center, that's about 5 or 6 cases a year. The people who are pregnant at that point have named that child, they've purchased a crib, they're expecting to have a child at the end of that delivery. That is not the scenario that they're walking out of that hospital with. These are extremely personal decisions, and I think it's insulting to people who are pregnant to envision that they are not the person who should be making that decision, and the government needs to protect us from itself by giving us bodily autonomy and enshrining it in the Vermont Constitution.